What is the Canadian government's plan for inflation? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Last week, the federal government quote-unquote showcased their $8.9 billion plan to help Canadians who are impacted by inflation. And there is some irony there. Part of the reason why inflation is so bad right now is because of all of the spending that the governments did around the world over the past couple years. It's been a crude lesson as to why you can't just print money to solve your problems, because the money devalues, and it's worthless. Now, there are other contributing factors here, like the war between Russia and Ukraine, but as we'll get to in a little bit, the government's attempt to paint this entire picture as the fault entirely of third-party actors is disingenuous. The Star reports that Deputy Prime Minister and also the Finance Minister, the same person, Chrystia Freeland, is defending a stay-the-course approach to inflation. Now, that's the actual plan here. This was a bit of a tricky move on behalf of the government because, although they were showcasing this $8.9 billion plan, really it was just a repackaging of previously announced budget items, like introducing national dental care. That was introduced months ago, but it was brought up again last week. If you consider the motivations at play here, it's pretty obvious that it's not attractive for the government to say, we're not planning on doing anything as of yet. Instead, they just brought some things out of their magic bag of tricks that were already talked about before, and they're hoping that the media headlines of this grand $8.9 billion plan will give them the hue of them actually doing something. The Deputy Prime Minister then goes on to say that the current global economy is unpredictable. That is to say that they're concerned if they do choose to do something, they could make matters worse, which is very possible. But they do say that if things worsen, although there is no measure for what that would look like, things are pretty bad as they are now, the government is quote-unquote ready to do more. Freeland then went on to give a spiel about how the cost of living concerns that average Canadians are experiencing are due to global pressures. And then she went on to say that Canada is not alone. Obviously, everyone knew that. Other countries have issues too with inflation, and she went on to compare. She said that in Canada, the average rate of inflation was about 6.8% in April, and then the UK was 9%, in Germany 7.4%, and 9.2% across the OECD. In the US, 8.6% in May. So Freeland is basically putting the case here that things really suck. The average Canadian is worrying about putting food on the table, but hey, on the bright side, it's worse in Europe. Now, unfortunately, the average Canadian who is struggling with inflation is not going to care about that. These comparative measures mean very little when the impacts of inflation that the government played a hand in bringing about are keeping people in misery right now within our own country. This message came off to me as very weird. It's almost as if she's saying be grateful that it's not as bad, that it's only terrible here. It could be catastrophic as if you were in some other country. And in some sense, too, she's also implying that the government has done things to keep it at this 6.8% in Canada, which is incorrect. They've done basically nothing to curb inflation. If anything, the central bank might have a hand in that by raising the interest rates, but that's a separate entity. The government has no hand or say in that. Well, they might have a hand or say underneath the table, but structurally, they're supposed to be separate. Now, of course, that's a good thing because the act of raising interest rates could be very unpopular. And if you're a politician whose entire career rests on remaining popular, especially within certain demographics, depending on who your key audience is, you may be reluctant to do something like that. Even if it'll benefit 80% of the country in a couple years, to preserve something like the homeowners and real estate investors who you rely on to remain in power, you might fight against something like that. These competing interests are the reason why the Bank of Canada was given independence in their monetary decisions. If we ever do get to a place where something like a UBI program becomes commonplace in Canada, I do think we'd have to replicate the Bank of Canada approach where a separate entity looks at that. Otherwise, it's just too much of a political toy. Now, back to Freeland. She goes on to say that the pandemic saw economic demand shift from services to goods, with supply chain challenges made worse by China's rolling shutdowns due to a COVID-0 policy, and Russia's war in Ukraine, which has driven up the price of food and fuel. Sure, but once again, These are not the two sole reasons why the entire world is facing rapid inflation. As we talked about, there were things the current government did to themselves, like printing money to the moon, like keeping interest rates rock bottom for years. Even this notion of rising fuel prices is very interesting. We had an opportunity to tackle that problem domestically with pipelines, and that's a different argument. We can have a debate on the pros and cons of it, but the fact of the matter is this. If you were truly concerned about fuel prices, there were ways in which we could have handled that. And people are going to be using fuel anyway. Is it better that it comes from Canada, or Saudi Arabia, or Russia, or any other country you can name here? It is a question of the lesser of the evils, and there was more to say about that discussion. It's clear that we do have to attempt to shift to a renewable economy, but to do that overnight, the average citizen is not ready for that. The average citizen is still relying on gas, and then to turn around and say that Russia and Ukraine are entirely to blame for the problem is once again disingenuous, because there were things that we could have done about it. Bringing up China too is interesting. There may have been supply chain issues that are causing impacts because of the COVID-0 policy. I'm perfectly willing to believe that argument, but to blame all supply chain issues on that, I don't think is true. And further, if that is the case and you're purporting it to be so, why are you relying so heavily on China to manufacture goods in the first place? You've got yourself in that problem. You didn't have to. Now, there have been calls across the political spectrum for the government to do things about gas prices, and Freeland said that the government will not dial back its plan to fight climate change and defended the consumer price on carbon, the carbon tax, which, according to the Star, the Conservatives have demanded to be dropped. Freeland then goes on to say that it's a key measure that the country needs to hit our greenhouse emission reduction targets, and that provinces do provide rebates, some at least, like Ontario. Now, two things can be true at once. Getting those greenhouse gas emission reduction targets is a good thing, but when the average Canadian can no longer afford gas, perhaps things have to be done in the short term. Otherwise, sacrifices will have to be made across the spectrum, and to impose further burdens on the average citizen, given these extraordinary times, might be going a bit too far. Now, on the other hand, I'd be perfectly okay with maintaining things like this carbon price if the government was providing proper alternatives. If we had things like amazing transit that connected multiple city hubs, basically no province in Canada has anything close to what other countries have developed. This lack of infrastructure makes Canadians especially reliant on things like individual personal vehicles, which we know are inefficient, so the bind we're in is problematic. Now, to get back to Freeland, of course, we mentioned that this is really just a repackaging of previous things that the government already announced, but just to highlight a couple. They're going to be putting an extra $1.7 billion into an enhanced Canada Workers' Benefit. There's going to be a 10% increase to old age security for Canadians over 75. And that's going to provide up to $766 more for 3 million seniors. There's going to be a one-time $500 payment this year to nearly 1 million low-income Canadian renters who are struggling with the cost of housing. And this is interesting too. It's actually not just low-income Canadians who are struggling. Of course, they're struggling the most, but even someone who would be considered the average income earner is having massive problems paying for things like rent, a mortgage if they're getting a house. So programs like this are very interesting. And then you have to ask the obvious question, what is a one-time $500 payment going to do, realistically? If you took that, because there's 1 million, roughly, people who would receive $500, so 500 million in total, is there something better that money could do that would alleviate pressures across the board for everyone? Is there something that we could do with that money to create a longer lasting ripple than just a one-time handout? It's a question to debate. Maybe not, maybe so. And then there's also the note about a commitment to create a dental care program for Canadians who earn less than $90,000. Here you encounter the same problem as with the previous item. $90,000 is not what it used to be. And if you're a single income household and that's your sole source, and let's say you're making $92,000 now, so you no longer qualify. You have a family of 4, 5, or 6. Are you going to be able to afford dental if it's not covered by your insurance? I don't think so. So the scope of the program is called into question there, and then even further, if we did want to give every Canadian who was having problems paying for dental these benefits, what would be the true cost of that? Because there are going to be many Canadians who fall through the nets given this arbitrary cutoff. The middle class has eroded dramatically. Now, overall inflation is worrisome. These metrics that we're seeing, like 8, 9, 10%, aren't even capturing the full scope of the matter. They're based on a basket of goods that may not represent your personal basket of goods, and they're leaving things out like housing. The true rate of inflation that the average individual might be facing could be many times more intense than that. So, to even have these numbers like 8, 9, 10% is just astronomical. The government and central banks were clearly confused when they were saying before that this was simply going to be a transitory phenomenon, that it was going to go away in just a little bit. It doesn't seem like that's the case. It seems like things are getting worse, and hopefully you're able to find ways to get through these rough times. Now, with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.